In a stunning political twist, former Vice President Mike Pence targets President Donald Trump and announces his intention to challenge MAGA's legacy with a 2028 presidential run. But before his words could make headlines, Vice President JD Vance steps in with one powerful line that instantly shuts down Pence, leaving the entire room in silence. This heated moment between two former allies exposes the deep divide inside the Republican Party and sets the stage for one of the most dramatic showdowns yet. The West Wing was unusually quiet that afternoon, the kind of silence that felt too heavy, too expectant like the air before a thunderclap. Vice President JD Vance sat across from President Donald Trump, a mug of black coffee in his hand as sunlight from the Oval Office windows glowed across the resolute desk. Trump was relaxed, grinning, as he flipped through briefing papers about the next wave of border wall expansions. The economy was roaring, energy prices falling, and MAGA's heartbeat pulsed stronger than ever. Then Vance's phone buzzed, a news alert. The name on the screen made his chest tighten. Mike Pence. He tapped it, and the headline hit like a punch. Mike Pence hints at 2028 presidential run, says he'll overcome MAGA to heal the GOP. JD froze. Overcome MAGA. He looked up. Trump met his eyes, waiting. Then both men burst into laughter. But it wasn't joy. It was disbelief mixed with fury. "Can you believe this guy, JD?" Trump said, shaking his head. But JD could already feel something else beneath that laughter. A rising heat in his chest. A sense that something bigger was coming. The laughter faded and JD leaned back, staring at the phone as if the words might change. But they didn't. Pence's smiling face stared back at him from the newsfeed. Neat hair, crisp suit, that calm Midwestern voice saying all the wrong things. Pence, the man who once stood beside Trump at every victory, now talking about healing the party. JD knew what that meant. It was code for erasing the MAGA spirit, for rewriting history. He remembered January 6th, the heartbreak, the moment Pence folded when America needed strength. JD had defended him once, even prayed for him, but not anymore. Trump spoke first, voice low and cold. He wants to heal the party. That means he wants to bury it. JD nodded, his jaw tightening. He's not just running, sir. He's trying to rewrite what you built. Outside, thunder rumbled. A storm was building over Washington. Trump turned in his chair, staring out the window. Then let's remind him who started this movement. JD didn't answer. He didn't have to because he already knew what he had to do. Hours later, the moment arrived. Pence was speaking live at a conservative conference in D.C. The kind filled with donors, cameras, and polite applause. JD stood backstage listening to Pence talk about values, civility, and moving beyond anger. The crowd nodded politely, but it was empty talk. Words that meant nothing to the people who built MAGA with sweat, tears, and hope. Then Pence said it. It's time to overcome the divisions that have torn our party apart. It's time to move past the MAGA years. JD stepped forward. Cameras turned. The crowd went silent. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. His words cut through the hall like a blade. "Mr. Pence, Ma isn't what divided this country. It's what saved it. You talk about healing, but how do you heal a wound if you're the one who made it?" The room froze. Pence's smile faltered. You could hear hearts beating, breaths catching. JD continued, his voice trembling with emotion. "You walked away when America needed courage. Now you want to lead it, sir. You can't lead the people you once left behind." For a full 10 seconds, no one moved. Not a whisper, not a breath, just silence. The kind that tells you history has just been made. Within minutes of JD Vance's powerful line, the room was frozen. Cameras blinked. Reporters exchanged stunned looks. Even the clicking of pens stopped. Pence's expression, usually calm and rehearsed, shifted to something unfamiliar: confusion. For the first time, he didn't have a ready verse or line to hide behind. JD stood firm, his hand resting on the podium, eyes locked on Pence. He didn't need to raise his voice. The quiet truth in his tone was enough to echo through every heart in that hall. When JD turned and walked off stage, whispers began. Some journalists stood in disbelief. Others rushed for their phones, already typing. JD Vance silences Mike Pence with one line. By the time JD reached the hallway, his phone was exploding. Notifications rolled in like thunder tweets, clips, and texts from staffers saying the video had gone viral in seconds. Trump's media team had already clipped the moment, posting it with one caption: JD Vance, strong, loyal, fearless, MAGA's next generation. In the silence that followed, Pence stared at the crowd. No one clapped. No one smiled. The weight of JD's words hung in the air like a storm cloud that refused to break. Back in the White House, President Trump was in the Situation Room reviewing updates from the border. Aides tried to brief him, but he was glued to a tablet screen replaying the viral moment. The clip had already hit 5 million views on X. JD's voice filled the room steady, emotional, unfiltered. When the camera cut to Pence's stunned face, Trump chuckled, leaned back, and said, an aide whispered, "Sir, it's trending everywhere. Number Vance speech. Number MAGA 2028. Number Pence regret." Trump looked around the room. They said, "No one could carry the torch after me." He said softly, "Well, they just met the man who will." Outside, rain began to fall on Washington, gentle at first. Inside, the MAGA war room came alive. JD's communications team scrambled to control the explosion. Interviews, news requests, statements. But JD, he sat in his office quietly, staring out the window, the glow of lightning flickering across his face. He hadn't done it for fame. He'd done it for truth and for the millions of forgotten Americans who still believed in it. Meanwhile, Pence sat in his hotel suite, tie loosened, staring at the TV. Every major network was replaying the clip. The caption read, "J. Vance leaves Mike Pence speechless." Commentators debated, but the tone was clear. Pence had lost control of the moment he thought would relaunch his career. The audience that once cheered him now flooded social media with disappointment. One post went viral. Pence talked about healing, but JD Vance reminded him what real courage looks like. Pence's team paced nervously. "We can fix this," one aide muttered. "We'll say he was misunderstood." But Pence cut him off, his voice barely above a whisper. "You can't fix truth." He turned to the window, watching lightning flash over the Capitol dome. For the first time, he felt what Trump and Vance had warned him about: the power of the movement he'd turned his back on. JD's words weren't just an attack. They were a mirror. And in that mirror, Pence saw what he'd become: the ghost of a legacy that moved on without him. By midnight, the entire country had seen the moment. Every major network was running the clip of JD Vance facing Mike Pence. The words, the stare, the silence that followed. It wasn't just a debate moment anymore. It was history. X, formerly Twitter, was on fire. Millions of Americans, truck drivers, veterans, factory workers, single moms, were flooding the comments. Some wrote, "Finally, someone said what we've all been thinking." Others posted crying emojis with captions like, "JD spoke for every forgotten American tonight." In the middle of all the chaos, a video surfaced of a small diner in Ohio. The owner played the clip on TV, and everyone in the diner stood up cheering when JD said the line, "You can't lead the people you once left behind." Old men wiped tears, a mother whispered to her teenage son. "That's what courage sounds like. Buy one." AMJD's face was everywhere on trending hashtags, in news graphics, in homemade memes calling him the voice of the people. And somewhere behind all the noise, Pence sat in silence, knowing this wasn't just another story. It was a shift, one he couldn't control. At exactly 1:45 a.m., JD's phone buzzed. The caller ID read, "Puss Trump." He stepped out into the White House balcony, the wind cool against his face as he answered. "Mr. President," Trump's voice came through, calm but proud. "Jay, I just saw it. You made history tonight. That's what leadership looks like." JD didn't know what to say for a second. "Sir, I wasn't trying to make headlines. I just couldn't stay silent anymore." Trump laughed softly. "That's why you're different. That's why people love you. You speak from the heart. You remind them we're not politicians. We're fighters for the forgotten." For a moment, there was quiet on the line, just the hum of wind and distant city noise. Then Trump said something that JD would never forget. "You didn't defend me tonight, JD. You defended America." JD stood there for a while after the call ended, looking over Washington. Lights flickering across the horizon. The movement wasn't just alive. It was roaring again. When dawn broke over Washington, The media was already at war. CNN called JD's words divisive. Fox called them historic. But the truth was simpler. America was listening again. At 7 a.m., JD walked into the West Wing. Aides and staffers paused as he passed. Some nodded, some smiled, one even whispered, "Thank you, sir." The entire building felt alive, like something had shifted overnight. Trump was waiting in the Oval Office with coffee ready. "Morning, hero," he said with a grin. JD chuckled, just doing what needed to be done. Trump leaned forward. Pence thought he could split the movement, but he forgot MAGA isn't an idea you kill with speeches. It's a heartbeat. You prove that. Outside, crowds were already forming at Lafayette Square. Patriots waving flags, holding signs that read, "JD Vance, America's voice, and MAGA forever." JD looked out the window and felt tears sting his eyes. Not for pride, not for power, but for the people. Those who had been silenced, mocked, and forgotten. Because that morning he knew he wasn't just defending a man, he was defending a movement that refused to die by 9 a.m. The media frenzy had reached fever pitch. Every newsroom in America had JD Vance's words on replay. Commentators argued, headlines screamed, and political analysts tried to predict what it all meant for 2028. But inside the White House, things were strangely calm. JD sat in his office, coffee in hand, scrolling through his phone. Each notification carried the same message: "You spoke for us." From farmers in Iowa to factory workers in Pennsylvania, Americans were pouring their hearts out online. A Marine veteran posted, "When JD spoke, it wasn't politics, it was truth." Another user wrote, "I cried, he reminded us why we believed in Trump in the first place." But JD wasn't smiling. He knew this wasn't about victory or fame. It was about something deeper, defending a movement built on the hopes of people who had been ignored for decades. Then his phone buzzed again. A message from his comms director. "Fox News wants you live at noon. CNN too. You've lit a fire, sir." JD exhaled slowly, looking toward the American flag outside his window. "Then let's speak," he murmured, "but not for politics, for the people." At exactly noon, JD Vance appeared on live TV. The studio lights glared, cameras rolled, and millions watched across the nation. The interviewer leaned forward, voice sharp. "Vice President Vance, did you mean to humiliate former Vice President Pence?" JD's gaze was steady. "No," he said softly. "I meant to remind him in America that leadership isn't about polished speeches. It's about standing firm when the world tells you to kneel." The host blinked. "So you're saying Pence failed? JD didn't flinch?" "I'm saying he forgot who he served. When you choose comfort over courage, history remembers." Silence filled the studio. Even the producer's voice in the earpiece went quiet. Viewers at home felt a chill, not from anger, but from truth. JD continued, voice trembling slightly. "This isn't about revenge, it's about redemption. MAGA isn't one man's dream, it's America's heartbeat, and we're not done fighting for it." Across the country, living rooms fell silent. Some people cried, others stood and applauded their screens. It wasn't politics anymore, it was conviction. In a quiet hotel suite just blocks away, Mike Pence sat alone, the TV still glowing with JD's interview replaying the host's final words echoed through the room. Vance didn't just speak, he reminded America why they believed. Pence leaned back, eyes closed, the weight of regret pressing down like an ocean. The phone beside him buzzed with missed calls, donors, old allies, and campaign advisors. But he didn't answer any. He knew what they wanted to say. He didn't need to hear it. The moment had slipped and Jad's words had carved it into stone. An aide finally entered, hesitant. "Sir, they're asking if you still want to move forward with your announcement." Pence stared out the window at the Capitol dome, distant and gleaming under the late morning sun. His lips parted, but no words came. Then almost to himself, he whispered, "I wanted to lead, but maybe I forgot why." The aide said nothing. The air between them felt sacred, heavy with truth. And in that silence, Pence understood something he hadn't in years. Courage isn't born in comfort, it's born in loss. The sun was high over Washington, but it felt like the entire nation had stopped to talk about one thing. JD Vance. His words had traveled far beyond TV studios. They were now echoing through factory floors, coffee shops, church gatherings, and even school parking lots. In Pennsylvania, a retired coal miner wiped his hands on his jeans and said to a friend, "That Vance boy, he talks like one of us. You can tell he means it." In Texas, a young mother posted online, "Even those who weren't usually political felt something shift. JD's words weren't about power. They were about heart in the West Wing." President Trump's staffers were buzzing. The communications team was already preparing talking points, but Trump waved them off. "Let the kid speak for himself," he said with pride. "He's the real deal." Meanwhile, Pence's circle tried to spin the story, but every headline told the same truth: Vance speaks for MAGA Pence. Left speechless. The day wasn't even over. Yet it already felt like a turning point in American politics. By mid-afternoon, Pence finally answered one of the many calls flooding his phone. The voice on the other end was hesitant. "Sir, this isn't going away. The base has turned JD's speech. It's everywhere." Pence didn't respond immediately. He stood by the window staring at the U.S. flag outside. The air in the room felt heavy, like it carried the weight of everything unsaid. "Maybe they've forgotten," he finally said softly. "Maybe they don't remember what I tried to stand for." The aide sighed. "With respect, sir, they remember, but they also remember what you didn't do." Pence closed his eyes. He could still hear JD's line ringing in his head. "You can't lead the people you once left behind." That one sentence had shattered something deep inside him. It wasn't anger that he felt. It was regret. Real, burning regret. He whispered, "Tell the team to cancel the evening press briefing." As the aide nodded and left, Pence sat back down alone again. The silence in the room wasn't peaceful anymore. It was punishing. As dusk fell over Washington, the crowd outside the White House grew larger. Men, women, and even children stood waving small American flags. They weren't there for a protest. They were there out of pride to show love for the movement that had given them a voice again. Reporters filmed the crowd, capturing the chants that filled the cool November air. Inside, JD Vance stood near a window, watching in disbelief. "They're not cheering for me," he murmured. "They're cheering for what we stand for." President Trump joined him, smiling proudly. "That's the sound of America waking up again," he said. "You reminded them that courage still lives in this building." JD nodded slowly, his voice heavy with emotion. "I just told the truth, sir." Trump placed a hand on his shoulder. "And that's why they'll never forget it." Down below, an elderly woman in the crowd whispered through tears, "He's the only one who talks like he remembers us." The nightlights of D.C. flickered against the sky. But inside the hearts of millions, something brighter had already been lit. Evening shadows stretched across Washington as cameras flashed outside the National Conservative Forum. Pence was scheduled to speak again. But this time, the crowd wasn't the same. There was tension in the air, the kind that comes when people already know they've witnessed a turning point. Inside, Pence stepped onto the stage, adjusting his tie with that same rehearsed calm. But the applause was thin, polite at best. Many in the audience were scrolling on their phones, watching clips of JD Vance's earlier remarks instead. Pence began, "We must restore dignity and unity." But halfway through his sentence, murmurs rose from the back rows. A young man shouted, "Where was your unity in 2021, Mike?" Another voice followed. JD already said, "What we all feel." The moderators tried to calm the room, but it was too late. The energy had shifted completely. One woman in the front row whispered to her husband, "It's over for him, isn't it?" And just like that, the man who once stood beside Trump on the campaign trail now stood alone under the stage lights, words trembling as they vanished into an ocean of silence. Back at the White House, the mood was different. The West Wing was alive, buzzing, electric, almost emotional. Staffers crowded around a television, replaying the chaotic scene from Pence's forum. Trump watched quietly from behind the resolute desk, his eyes sharp but unreadable. JD stood beside him, hands in his pockets, saying nothing. Finally, Trump broke the silence. "He underestimated you, kid." JD glanced at him, unsure how to respond. "It's not about me, sir. It's about what people are feeling. Tired of being ignored, tired of the same empty words." Trump smiled faintly, leaning forward. You did what I used to do. You spoke like one of them, not above them. That's power, real power. Outside the Oval Office, aides were whispering, reporters were calling, and messages were pouring in from all corners of the country. Governors, senators, factory workers, all saying the same thing. JD spoke for us. JD stepped to the window, looked out into the night sky over the Washington Monument, and whispered to himself, "Then I'll never stop." That night to us, something rare happened. Across small towns and big cities alike, people felt something stir in their hearts. In an old diner in West Virginia, a group of veterans sat around a flickering TV watching JD's speech replay for the fifth time. One of them, a man with trembling hands, said quietly, "It's been years since I believed a politician could still mean what he says. But this kid does." In Ohio, a factory worker who hadn't voted in years recorded himself saying, "I cried tonight. JD spoke like my brother, like someone who remembers what it means to work hard and love this country." Meanwhile, in Indiana, Pence sat in silence once more, watching the same footage. The sound of JD's words echoed through the room. "You can't lead the people you once left behind." For a moment, even Pence's eyes watered. He wasn't angry. He was haunted. Back in D.C., JD knelt in quiet prayer before leaving his office. He didn't pray for victory. He prayed for unity, the kind only truth could build. And that silent prayer was heard across a nation already starting to believe again. Later that night, the streets outside the White House shone with lights and emotion. Hundreds had gathered, waving flags and holding up homemade signs saying, "Jay speaks for us, MAGA forever, and truth doesn't bow." News reporters stood shoulder to shoulder, their cameras flashing. But this wasn't just another political crowd. It was a movement that once again stood on its feet. Inside, JD Vance walked toward one of the high windows and looked down at them. The chants were soft but steady, rolling like thunder in the distance. USJD. A young boy sitting on his father's shoulders held up a sign in crayons that said, "You gave my dad hope again." JD swallowed hard, his voice trembling as he whispered, "They're the reason I spoke." An aide beside him nodded. "Sir, you didn't just shut down Pence. You reignited something people thought was gone." JD turned back toward the hallway, eyes full of quiet fire. "Then we don't stop now," he said softly. "Not until every American knows their voice still matters." Outside, the crowd kept chanting under the cool November sky long after the cameras went off. In a quiet hotel suite across town, Mike Pence stood in front of a mirror. The TV behind him was replaying JD's speech for what felt like the 100th time. Each word cut deeper than the last, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. JD hadn't attacked him with hate. He'd disarmed him with honesty. Pence placed both hands on the counter, staring at his reflection. The man who once stood beside Trump now looked smaller, older, as if regret itself had drawn new lines across his face. His phone buzzed again. Another text from an old campaign donor. "Pull out, Mike. The base isn't with you," he sighed, turning the TV volume up just as JD's voice filled the room again. Leadership isn't about titles or headlines. It's about standing with the people when it's hardest to. For a moment, Pence looked away, his lips trembling. "Maybe I forgot that," he murmured. The aide outside the door hesitated to knock. Hearing the faint sound of something unexpected, a man once known for strength, now quietly crying. By 10 p.m., JD's line, "You can't lead the people you once left behind," had become the most replayed clip on every network. Commentators called it the sentence that stopped a man's career. In homes across America, ordinary people were watching it again and again. Not out of political loyalty, but because something about it felt real. In Kansas, a grandmother who had lost her son in Afghanistan whispered through tears, "That boy speaks from his heart." In Ohio, a young welder told his wife, "That's why I voted Trump. That's why I still believe." And in schools, churches, and diners, people who hadn't agreed on much in years found themselves nodding together for once. Back in the White House, JD sat alone in the Roosevelt room, scrolling through his phone. The messages were endless prayers, thank yous, and even apologies from people who had once doubted him. He set the phone down and looked up at a portrait of Abraham Lincoln on the wall. "I don't deserve their praise," he said quietly. "I just told the truth. And in that moment, simple, still, and deeply human, America listened. It was close to midnight now, yet no one in Washington seemed ready to sleep. The city's skyline glimmered under a cold November sky, but inside every newsroom, every diner, and every small-town living room, the same replay was looping JD Vance's words echoing across America. You can't lead the people you once left behind. That line had become more than a quote. It was a wound and a wake-up call all at once. In the White House press room, journalists whispered among themselves, some even teary-eyed. One of them muttered, "That wasn't a speech, that was a moment." Outside, people gathered with candles and flags, not in protest, but in pride. It felt like America had remembered its heartbeat again. Inside the Oval Office, President Trump sat silently. The glow of the television reflecting off the golden drapes, he looked over at JD and said softly, "Kid, you didn't just defend me tonight. You defended the truth." JD nodded, his jaw tight. "I just said what millions feel, sir." Trump smiled faintly. "And that's why they'll never forget you." Back in his quiet hotel room, Pence's phone kept buzzing, but he couldn't bring himself to answer a single call. His aides had stopped knocking hours ago. The silence was thick, broken only by the sound of the TV replaying JD's speech one more time. Each replay felt heavier than the last. The crowd's applause, the raw conviction in JD's voice, the truth he couldn't deny. Pence finally reached for his phone, thumb hovering over the call button for an old friend, but he stopped. What could he even say? That he didn't mean it? That he still believed he was right? He stood up and walked to the window. Below, reporters were still camped outside, their cameras waiting for a statement that would never come. He whispered to himself, "Maybe I should have listened more, not to the politicians, but to the people." A photo of him and Trump from the 2016 campaign sat on the table. He picked it up slowly. The smiles in that picture felt like ghosts now. Pence sighed deeply, knowing the truth no spin could fix. He had lost the people long before he ever lost power. By dawn, JD Vance's words had reached every corner of the country. Morning news anchors replayed the clip with awe, calling it the moment that reshaped the Republican future. But for millions of Americans, it wasn't about politics anymore. It was personal. In Michigan, a retired veteran turned off his TV and whispered, "Finally, someone who talks like he still believes in us." In Georgia, a single mother cried quietly while scrolling through JD's speech on her phone. "He made me feel proud again," she said softly to her daughter. And in Texas, truck drivers at a roadside diner raised their coffee mugs in unison and said to the man who spoke truth. Back in D.C., JD sat at his desk, exhausted but calm. His staff wanted to prepare another statement, but he waved them off. "No," he said, "sometimes silence speaks louder." He leaned back, watching the sunrise reflect off the PTOAC. The world outside buzzed with energy, but inside him there was only peace. Because for once America wasn't divided by anger, it was united by truth. The sun had barely broken through the clouds when the replay of JD Vance's voice echoed across every major news channel in America. Anchors didn't even try to hide their awe. It wasn't a speech, one analyst said softly. It was history, across the country. The reaction was emotional, raw, human, unfiltered. Truckers on morning routes wiped tears from their eyes. Office workers paused at their desks. Families gathering for breakfast turned their TVs up, watching in silence as JD's words replayed again. You can't lead the people you once left behind. Inside the West Wing, reporters were already camped outside. The press secretary walked briskly past them, her voice firm. No, Vice President Vance will not be commenting this morning, but JD was already awake. He stood by the Oval Office window beside President Trump, who was sipping coffee, watching the sunrise over the National Mall. Trump turned to him. You said what I've been wanting to say for years, JD. But you said it better. JD didn't smile. I just said what they needed to hear, sir. And somewhere out there, millions of Americans nodded, knowing he meant every word. By mid-morning, something extraordinary was happening. People weren't just talking, they were feeling. Videos flooded the internet of men and women crying as they watched JD's defense of Trump, and MAGA, a veteran from Arizona, posted a tearful video. When JD spoke, it felt like my brothers who never came home were finally honored. He spoke for us. A nurse from Michigan tweeted, "For once, I didn't feel invisible. Thank you, JD." Even teachers, mechanics, and small business owners were writing in, not out of politics, but gratitude. Meanwhile, Pence's silence was deafening. Reporters surrounded his hotel asking, "Will you respond to JD Vance's statement?" But he never came out. Back in D.C., President Trump met JD in the Situation Room. "They're saying you united the base again overnight," Trump said with pride. JD looked humbled. "It's not me, sir. It's the people. They just needed to remember who they are." Trump laid a hand on his shoulder. "Then you've done something bigger than politics, son. You reminded America of its heart. And in that quiet room, both men knew something far greater than a campaign had just begun." By noon, Pence finally stepped out of his hotel, his face pale under the sunlight. Cameras flashed, microphones pressed forward, and questions flew like arrows. "Mr. Pence, do you still plan to run in 2028? Do you have a message for Vice President Vance?" He opened his mouth and no sound came out. The crowd was waiting, reporters recording every twitch of emotion, and instead of speaking, he simply lowered his head. Inside, he knew what the silence meant. The people had already decided, not through polls or speeches, but through something deeper. He returned inside, sat alone by the window, and turned on the news. The screen showed JD speaking to a crowd outside the White House, his voice calm, strong, and sincere. "We fight not out of hate, but out of hope, because we love this country too much to see it fall apart again." Pence watched quietly, his chest rising and falling slowly. His eyes glistened as he whispered, "He's the future, and maybe that's how it should be." Outside, the world cheered, not out of anger, but out of unity. And for the first time in years, America felt alive again. As evening fell, Washington stood still. No traffic horns, no shouting pundits, just the hum of cameras and the whisper of wind across Pennsylvania Avenue. Every major network had the same image on screen: JD Vance walking toward a podium outside the White House. He wasn't flanked by advisors or flashing lights, no teleprompter, no grand introduction. Just him, steady, calm, and real. "I wasn't planning to speak again tonight." JD began softly, his voice carrying across the crowd. "But when the truth is attacked, silence becomes weakness." The reporters leaned forward. The audience watching at home held their breath. JD paused, then said the line that would be replayed 1,000 times. "You don't fix the soul of America by turning your back on the people who built it." The crowd erupted, not in wild cheers, but in tears. Grown men clutched their flags. Mothers held their children tighter. It wasn't politics anymore. It was heart. Somewhere in a hotel room across town, Pence turned off the TV. His reflection in the black screen stared back at him, quiet, humbled, and utterly alone. By midnight, the nation was wide awake. From farms in Iowa to diners in Georgia, Americans were talking again. Not about division, but about dignity. Clips of JD's speech flooded social media. One video showing an elderly veteran saluting through tears went viral with the caption, "I haven't cried since I buried my brothers until tonight." Inside the White House, JD sat alone in the Roosevelt room, staring at his phone. It was buzzing, "We reminded America who she is." Outside, the crowd still lingered under the moonlight, singing the national anthem. Their voices rough, imperfect, but united rose into the night sky. And for the first time in a long time, the country sounded like one nation again. The next morning, sunlight broke over Washington like a promise. Every newspaper headline carried the same words: "Vance shuts down Pence and reawakens America." JD Vance walked quietly into the Oval Office where President Trump stood by the window, smiling. "You did something last night, kid," Trump said. "You didn't just defend MAGA, you gave it a heartbeat." JD smiled humbly. "Sir," Trump shook his head. "No, JD, it's our movement now, and it belongs to the people." As they shared that moment, the cameras outside captured the American flag, waving against a bright blue sky. For millions watching, it wasn't just a flag anymore. It was hope. And as the story of that night spread across homes, hearts, and screens, JD's final words from his speech echoed everywhere. This isn't about politics. It's about people. It's about faith. It's about America. And we're just getting started. If this story moved your heart, if it made you cry, think or believe again, don't just scroll past, hit like, drop a comment, and subscribe right now. Let your voice be part of this moment. And if you want to unlock exclusive behind-the-scenes stories, join our membership today. Together, we'll keep telling the stories that America needs to hear. Stay strong, stay hopeful, and as JD Vance said, we're just getting started.